couple of you asked related questions that I want to address now. In particular, Tina and Lottie. Tina asked a question of how do you change the culture of decision making from consequence to appropriateness, and by implication I took that to mean how do you change from appropriateness to consequence as well. And in addition, Lottie asked, you know, when is it time to shake things up in a firm and change the organization's accepted rules? When is it time to change the logic of appropriateness and the way in which they're operating? So both theories are kind of about organizational change, and particularly with regard to our kind of decision logics. And I think in the case of Tina's question of switching from one to the other kind of logic of decision making, we have to think of them as modes of rationality. So they're really modes of persuasion in a way. They're reasonings. And so when your firm is doing decisions, it's feasible that you could persuade them by talking about consequences that are too much, that most reasonable persons would agree with, right? And that's often how people interpret the Allison case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, that the costs were just so high that most rational people or reasonable people, and that's why we need them in those positions, would never allow Armageddon to happen, right? On the other hand, the one of logic of appropriateness is more about an identity, that you don't want to be that type of firm or that type, you don't want to be known as that. It's inconsistent, it's not a match with what the firm's goals and deeper social structure are. And I think those can be persuasive in convincing a firm to adopt that viewpoint. However, as a mode of reasoning to adopt that, that's more of a cultural change, more of a processual change at the collective level for the whole firm and how it operates. And I think that's a little more difficult endeavor. I think the theory of bureaucratic process and coalition model is kind of useful in some sense, in that here you have an effort to kind of mobilize people toward an interest. And it could be that your interest is to make them switch in terms of their theoretical or their way of making sense of organizational problems or the way the organization operates. And I think that's what's nice about this course, at least from my vantage point, that each of these theories offer a distinct perspective, and organizations may do well by seeing things from these different vantages and systems, as opposed to thinking they have a particular list of prescriptions. A theory can kind of be a way of a catalog system into a whole set of different solutions if you only viewed the firm from that angle and from that theoretical mode. So I think in many ways the adoption of a distinct way of organizing and mode or theory of organizing will afford all kinds of solutions. So whether one seems best fitting for your firm and convincing them of that might require the mobilization and efforts that politics, that bureaucratic politics model kind of affords. But I think in terms of practical solutions as well, Robert had a wonderful reply, I think, and he offers some very nice suggestions under your post. As for when it's time to challenge and shake things up that Lottie asked, in many ways, again, I have to say in week 5 on organizational learning, this is something we'll address. We change rules when they don't work. When things break down, we suddenly reflect on what might be a more appropriate way of moving along, or we consider options and think about their consequences. But you can also search more broadly to see if other solutions exist that are more appropriate when this happens, or you can predict which ones have positive consequences. So I think, when there are problems, suddenly this opens up search. And whether you're in kind of a suboptimal or a learning trap, which we'll talk about in week 5, that you had one success and it was chance that happened, and now you've kind of locked in and doing things that way, even though there's probably more optimal ways of doing things. That's one trap. You have to evoke search. You have to constantly create practices that allow that. In another case, you might have one bad thing happen by chance and avoid that procedure from then on, even though that might have been the best practice for your firm. So we have these learning traps that can occur from our deciding, the process of deciding things. And we have to find ways to get out of those. And Jim March has a nice description of this later in the course where he talks about how we switch modes from exploration to exploitation. And if we go too far in any direction, that we're always exploring for new rules or creative solutions, that we never really ever learn how to apply the ones we have really well. And vice versa, if we're always just using the same ones and we get really good at using those practices or those procedures, that we don't consider others that may be more effective. So I think the balance between exploration, exploitation, and the problems that arise that challenge our rules, and considering that we should put in place practices that allow us to explore somewhat without constantly jumping from one procedure to the next. If we avoid that kind of extreme, that would be ideal, I think.